Thank you for the glowing introduction. Now I have to live up to it. But as Vince has said, my name's Bec. I'm a place strategist as part of the Frost collective team. And I must admit, it's slightly intimidating standing up here in front of you all this evening, comparative to when I last did this talk in London, where there was fewer familiar faces and clients out there, but I hope that you find some of these musings that I've had around the topic of somewhere, not anywhere, really interesting, because I think we're at a really interesting point in time around place and placemaking, and so there's a rich discussion for all of us to have, whether you sit in the developer camp, the architect camp, the builder camp, all of us are here together to kind of have a bit of a discussion. As Vince says, we welcome questions, but yeah, really to share some perspectives. And as Vince said, it was really fantastic to have the opportunity to go over to London in November and have that kind of conversation in a room of really diverse disciplines. And particularly, I think I was very conscious that I was taking the stage amongst a whole lot of brilliant visualisers, animators, architects who, as you can imagine, had some absolutely stunning photorealistic renders to accompany their talks. It's not particularly what we deliver here. We deliver other things that are brilliant and fantastic within these walls, but it's not the photorealistic renders. And so we decided to kind of pair the insights I'm going to share with you tonight with something a little bit more lo-fi in terms of illustrations. And to that, we look to our brilliant in-house illustrator, Shelley Shao, who's here tonight. So you'll see some of her work accompanying things today. But yeah, we wanted to give a bit of light and shade. We couldn't compete with the photorealistic renders, so we wanted to, I suppose, entertain people in a different way. So I suppose just to kick things off, many of you probably know all about us, but for those that are not so familiar, obviously Frost has been around for over 20 years. And when Frost Place was created about 4 or 5 years ago to really, I suppose, hone our skills and our team around, I suppose, the nuances and potential of what we see as a really exciting market, the place and property space. And we've had a great privilege of working with some fantastic clients and partners, many of who are in the room tonight, so a big hello, to, I suppose, really push the boundaries of what's possible within this sector. Often it feels like, it can be a bit cookie cutter within the place and property sector. And for us, it's about bringing the philosophy that's always been at the heart of what Frost is all about, that real ideas-led creative, to the fore, and also kind of unpacking this new space around place visioning, working with developers, with government, with community really early on in the piece to define what a vision of a place is before, consultant teams are potentially put together or before designs are already laid down. So for us, it was this really interesting opportunity to, I suppose, expand our creative process in a different space. And this is what I'm going to kind of talk more about today. So yes, place. It's a really interesting time at the moment. I think there's so much discussion around placemaking, place shaping, place this, place that. It seems to have hit real fever pitch. And particularly, I think, coming out of COVID, there seemed to be us in the industry have been talking about place for years. It's really common for us. But during COVID, I was having conversations with my neighbours, with my friends, with my dad, who's an electrician and doesn't normally talk in my language, about place and about what makes a good place. And it was coming really naturally through conversation. It's almost like when our place options were more limited, it really drew into stark relief what a great place really is and what constitutes that. And I think during COVID, obviously, we all kind of rediscovered our neighbourhoods in more detail, and for better and worse, we rediscovered some of our neighbours, but our local shops, our local cafes, that kind of zeroing in on our places was really acute. And it kind of led to this trend that we're starting to observe more and more coming out of COVID, which is around hyperlocalism, where really people are so uniquely, I suppose, appreciative and protective almost of the nuances and the unique characteristics of their suburbs, their streets, their blocks. There's this real zeroing in. It's almost like when our place options were more limited, we were really passionate about what constitutes our places. And I think increasingly, we kind of realise that places aren't just where we go. They fundamentally shape who we are, right? And so in that way, it makes sense that we want our places to be as unique as we are ourselves. What makes a good place for me is going to be vastly different from someone else. And I think that kind of understanding and that nuance really started to come through. But I think time and time again, we've all probably been in focus groups, we've all had conversations where it's like, oh, new development, I don't want to live in Legoland, I don't want a soulless cliche, I don't want a cookie cutter development. But not increasingly, we continue to kind of see these non-places continue to roll out. And I think they're truly still dragging our cities down with them. You know, making great places is not about adding a park at the end of the journey or some public art. And placemaking is definitely not about creating a brand that you just lay over the top of a design once everything is resolved. Truly creating a great place and great placemaking is about marrying ideas with empathy and really understanding how to co-create places with community through that journey from the outset. And I think importantly, we need to be really cognizant of this because we're in an era where people are very much leading with their values, possibly more so than ever. You know, we have things like election results, we have coming out of COVID, people are demanding things better. I was only just talking about this with someone here tonight. We're more vocal, we're more advocating for what we believe is better in a whole range of different sectors, but particularly when it comes to place. We've almost acquired this new language through COVID, and so there is this impetus to really deliver better places. So I think also there's this understanding that it's simply irresponsible to develop things that aren't going to be embraced by generations for many, many years to come, as the great cities have been. So there's a real focus on doing this now. And as I said, I first gave this talk over in London. And as I was doing the research to kind of contextualise it to the local market and the local kind of audience there, I found it really interesting. I came across the UK Office of Place, which was recently launched by the UK government. And their whole charter is around creating places that are beautiful, enduring and high functioning. And that's their kind of charter. And one of the lines in their launch press release really drove it home to me, really nailed exactly what placemaking and kind of place visioning should really set out to achieve. And that line was, people don't want their built environment to be a fragment of anywhere. They want it to be a somewhere. And for me, this really hits the nail on the head, because somewhere, this idea of somewhere really rang in my head, as you probably picked up from the title of this talk. This idea of, and I'm sure all of you can kind of think of a somewhere as opposed to an anywhere. Those anywheres, those kind of run-of-the-mill airport terminals, those shopping centres that could be anywhere in Sydney, those apartment blocks that are really generic and disorientate you when you walk in. Those are all the anywheres, but I'm sure you can kind of draw your mind to a somewhere, your favourite restaurant, your favourite park, these things that connect with you because they have a strong sense of identity. So I suppose what we want to focus on tonight is, all right, we acknowledge we want to create somewheres, but how do we go about doing that? Because we don't want to create an anywhere, and we definitely don't want to create an everywhere, right? And I think that's obviously something that we're all very cognizant of in a hyper-globalised world. We know that Brooklyn-style hipster cafes have proliferated the entire planet. We don't want to just replicate the everywhere. So we really want to get to the heart of what this somewhere is. And so that's what I'm going to spend some time with you tonight talking about, is that how we at Frost Collective really use place visioning to ensure that we're creating places that are as unique as they are loved. And I've signed you all up without your acknowledgement or your consent to be on the right side of history here. So I want this to be inclusive, right? I'm not saying that we have all the answers. I think that all of us have a role to play, regardless of what our role is, in making great places and making them somewheres in different ways, so hopefully all of you can take something out of tonight's talk. Because I think we all have a role to play in making marvellous places for our tomorrows. So let's get into it. First point, I think it makes sense, right? If you want to create a great place, you have to set out with a vision for what that place is going to be from the outset. And when I say vision, I don't mean subdivisions, I don't mean structure, and I don't mean services. So often we start building places or designing places without kind of fundamentally contemplating arguably the most important thing we want to end up with, which is the ambience, the atmosphere, the interactions, the things that we want people to gravitate towards at these places. What's that? because that should be the fundamental part of our vision. All of these elements are important, but there has to be a vision that unites them from the outset. I'm going to call on a quote from a brilliant client that we worked with a couple of years ago. His name is Bob Lecrae. He runs Generous Collective over in LA. He said to us, you've got to start with the feeling. And Bob knows how to create a great place, right? Like, he worked with Steve Jobs on the original Apple Store experience. He's worked with Disney. And he's right. You know, great places are about how they make you feel. They're a multi-sensory experience. And if I ask you to cast your mind back, as I said, when you think about a somewhere, right? Think about your favorite restaurant, your favorite cafe, your favorite place overseas, your favorite park. And if I ask you to think about that through the lens of feeling, I'm sure you could pretty quickly describe to me through the lens of feelings what that place makes you feel. And I think investing in kind of getting to the heart of what those feelings are really early on in the piece gives you access to the most valuable piece of real estate, a place in people's hearts. And that's where we need to get to. People think it's fluffy, people think it's, you know, artsy stuff, but it's actually fundamental to getting to a place that's really unique and meaningful. And just a bit of an example of this, you know, we at Frost Collective, both our team and the Urbanite team, have had a really long-standing relationship with AMP Capital in delivering the Key Quarter project. For many of you who've probably been down there, it's largely opened now as of last year, but it's a huge kind of city-shaping development. It's a new neighbourhood for Sydney. It's 2 city blocks. And we worked with some wonderful design partners on that, 3XN, BVN, SJB, Sylvester Fuller, Make. You know, there was a whole array of designers involved in this and bringing this to life. But we've been involved in it for 12 years, and we got involved really early before 3XN was even on board. And we thought about the feeling. What is the feeling that people want to feel when they arrive here? When they wake up in their apartment, when they come down into the lanes for lunchtime, when they're visiting here on New Year's Eve. And that feeling was one of generosity, a place that gives back at every turn. And for us, this was something that then bled into every design brief, every retail strategy, and it really truly shaped the place. And it was that kind of vast shift from what a lot of harbourside real estate is in our beautiful harbour city, that it doesn't feel open and it doesn't feel inclusive. And I think that getting in early with such big consultant teams involved, that kind of initial feeling and visioning really sets the North Star for everyone to work towards collectively. And over a period of obviously so many years, it's been really fundamental to the whole process. So if I could urge you all, I would say always start with the feeling. Get into those deep, emotional, evocative territories really early, have the deep and meaningfuls. It does sound fluffy, but it's actually fundamental to getting you to a really interesting place. Secondly, a word on, obviously, if we're going through the lens of creating a somewhere, we've spoken about identity, we need to go through that in a human-centered lens and think about empathy, think about engagement. And for us, I sometimes find it quite remarkable, and this goes for design, architecture, and development. Often there's little investment in, I suppose, primary research into the end users. There's a lot of primary research often done into materials innovation and a whole array of other things, but the actual investment in primary research often isn't done. So yeah, I find it really interesting because we obviously live in such a data-rich age where data is almost ubiquitous to every consumer interaction. Often it's the case that we're relying on pretty basic secondary research, and I really think that does hamper our ability to get under the skin and truly go, this place connects with the user needs and requirements that we're going to deliver at the end of the day. Or worse still, community consultation is seen as a rubber stamping exercise that we just go through to after the design is already realised and after it's all said and done. And I think that is a vital misstep in terms of actually getting, you know, those true insights. And I can't tell you that I've never been in a insight gathering phase where I haven't learned something that is completely out of my periphery vision altogether. You always hear something new because there's that closeness to the actual end users. So once you start working with genuine empathy from your audiences, right, they become somebodies in your process. And those somebodies can offer invaluable insights to really enable you to shape the sense of identity that that place really needs to harness. And it's truly invaluable. Often we have interesting conversations with some of our clients where we're all about innovation, tech hubs, innovation precincts, and sometimes the descriptions or sometimes the original concept designs don't look dissimilar to something like this, right? It's almost like we're projecting the Jetsons. And I always find this really confounding because it's like, why do we think the future looks like what the space race kind of left us with in the 1960s? It's almost like we're looking backwards instead of looking forwards. And I think it's really interesting because then you talk to users and more often than not, they're looking for something like this. They're looking for a village-like atmosphere. They're looking for connection to nature. They're looking for technology that, yes, streamlines their lives. Ultimately, they want it to give more time with their kids or more time to doing the things that they love. They don't want to live in this data-enabled smart world. Like it's kind of at odds with sometimes what other people are projecting as what the future looks like. And I'll give you a real-world example of this. A couple of years ago, we worked with a developer, an airport authority, who were essentially looking to level a coastal dune landscape, complete with kangaroos, to create an aerospace tech hub. But fortunately, this developer was really open to the idea of doing some primary research into the end user. And so we went about creating personas and doing empathy interviewing to really understand who the end users of this aerospace tech hub would be. They were going to be the cutting edge leaders in aerospace innovation, but what do they actually want out of this place? What was going to make them come to work? What was going to make them potentially move here to work here? All of these questions that kind of weren't really answered in this, some of these initial briefs that I was talking about, funky facades and big digital innovation hubs and lots of concrete. And really interestingly, having conversations with these leaders in aerospace technology, as Bob said, you've got to start with the feeling. And that feeling for these people was being uplifted and being uplifted every day. I mean, don't we all want to feel uplifted every day? But what was fascinating for us was the reality that these people don't talk in our language in this kind of, place visioning, branding, marketing speak. They deal in a very different realm in kind of aerospace engineering. But they were able to really easily convey to us what exactly they needed to feel uplifted every day. For them, it was about that connection to nature. They spoke about this being a regional location, coastal location, where a lot of them had moved there for that lifestyle. So they didn't want to then depart from that life in the morning and then head to this place that felt like the Jetsons during the day and then head back. They'd made a purposeful decision to move there. So for them, it was really critical that that was replicated. They wanted places that they could mentally and physically conduct exercise. They wanted to know about the Indigenous story of this place. They wanted that connection to the existing dunal landscapes. For these people, concrete was the enemy, as were these kind of funky tech-enabled facades. It wasn't what they were interested in. This tech hub would not only have been a soulless cliche that would have tragically destroyed a dunal landscape, but it would have been the antithesis of what the actual end users wanted. And so for us, it was really heartening to see the developers really step up to the plate and go, okay, we have to rethink all of this. And that kind of place visioning set around this idea of being uplifting really enabled us to carve out a really unique place proposition for this place that had a unique frame of reference that then steered the development in a really different direction. And now their kind of reference imagery is looking much more like this. Very different to where we were previously, very much not about a tech hub. Sorry, there was more images there, but I'm kind of rolling with this tech. If I get a new slide, I'm going to take it. And yeah, I think it was the research not only enabled us to save a precious environment, these coastal dunes that were going to get flattened. It put forward a very specific way to develop within them and a very specific place experience. And in addition to that, it put forward a really unique leasing proposition that was in contrast to the other tech hubs and innovation precincts that were out there competing for the same talent, the same tenants. And it created a really unique proposition to attract talent as well. So it's not just that good places are good, they actually are a good commercial investment as well. And I suppose going from one curve that you see here, hopefully to the next one, all of us in this room that deal with place delivery understand that it takes time, right? We're all working on projects that probably got delivery timelines of 2, 5, 10, 20, 30 years. They're long, right? And I think for us in this industry, potentially more so than other industries out there, it's really critical for us to get ahead of the curve. And I'm sure all of you in this room are fairly aware with the sociological curve of adoption. And obviously how at the start of the curve, if you'll indulge me for a moment, if my slides behave, we've obviously got the early adopters that pick up new ideas, new thinking really quickly. They're surging up there with all of that new kind of passion and energy. And then we've got mainstream adoption, where things become, more everyday, more readily accepted, it's everywhere. And then you've got the other end of the curve, which is kind of where things start to drop off, where that engagement drops off, and it's really the poor laggards at the end that are kind of a bit late to the party. So for us in place delivery, obviously where we want to be, as everyone in branding will always tell you, you want to be ahead of the curve, but I think it's even more important for us is that we've got to be ahead of the curve because our delivery takes so much time. So we don't want to be outmoded by the time things come out of the ground. And what we're seeing, if we don't have a place vision and we don't have the user insights and that real empathetic view of what the user needs are, we're really at risk at falling in that safe zone in the middle, where it's very trend driven, where it's stuff that's we can see, we can find precedents, we can sell it into the clients really easily. But it's a real risk, right? Because by the time it gets out of the ground, it's going to be outmoded. And not only that, it creates a sea of same. All the green walls that we see in commercial buildings, all the Scandi-inspired interiors, all the multi-use precincts that are kind of fundamentally based around things that now should really be table stakes, like community and sustainability. It's all very safe, but it's all very same. So if we're to create true somewheres, we do need to really kind of bound for the start of that curve. And as this slide now says, safe is risky, right? In this context, safe is risky. So we've got to try and kind of always push to be ahead. So how do we get away from safe? As I told a room full of visualization experts over in London, I see their role being really fundamental in driving us to the front of the curve. Because it's really hard to imagine stuff you can't see. So for them, I said to them, you need to help us. If we're going to try and sell in these things that don't have a precedent reference, we need your help to kind of make the improbable, make the impossible seem real, seem tangible in some way. But I think for all of us in the room, there may be some visualizers out there. I think it's up to all of us, to push harder for the improbable, the impossible, as they're things that will kind of project out and differentiate our places, but also build a better future for what they may be. So to be out in front of the curve, I think we need to create places that are truly somewheres. We at Frost believe that this is all about kind of this mix of empathy, as we've touched on before, centered on that engagement, but also fundamentally this imagination that allows us to push to the front of the curve. Which leads me really nicely, surprisingly, to my next point, which is ideas power identity. For any of you that have worked with Frost before, we're all about ideas and idea-led solutions. For us, aesthetics aren't enough. Aesthetics are great, we all love beautiful design, but they can be somewhat limiting in terms of where you take things, particularly over projects that last decades and have a continuity for generations to come. If there's an idea that sits at the heart of that, there's so many ways you could take that, so many different ways you can push and pull it. And so for us, it's about coming up with that idea. And in our place visioning work, we have a framework where we do that, where we really start with a place idea, which is our proposition. So that's our true north. That's our single-minded place idea that sits as our North Star that everything tracks against. And then we have our pillars that then sit under that and make things more practical, actually starting to inform how things might roll out on the ground. And then obviously we have our proof points that fundamentally link the development strategy with the place strategy. So things become actionable. And for us, this kind of structure is really important because, as I said, if you can't see it, it's hard to imagine it, but everything you can imagine is real. So for us, the structure and the framework and getting it down is really critical because, as Picasso says here, it's very hard to conjure things that you can't imagine. So having this framework, having this point of reference for consultant teams, for all of us, is a really critical thing. And new ideas, obviously, are the antithesis of following trends and getting us out of that safe zone. And I think really critically, we need imagination right now. We're undoubtedly in a very challenging era. We're up against a whole bunch of different challenges, whether it be housing affordability, health crises, environmental crises. All of these things are really prevalent. And I think all of us need to try and conjure that imagination in ourselves really critically. And we can only imagine better. We can only do that if we can imagine better than we have in the past. And yes, it's true, we do have AI. My slide gave away my next point, but yes, we do have AI that's helping us, I suppose, experiment and expand the ways that we think, connect, and test things out. But I really fundamentally believe that all of that technology is really not, it's nothing without the human intelligence and imagination that sits behind it to really ignite it and guide it, as well as the ambition to do something really remarkable and worthwhile with that technology. And I think this is where we see organisations like ourselves and a number of you in the room coming to the table with that real, I suppose, imaginative attitude. Maybe we're not wed to a discipline, but we are kind of, I suppose, creative thinkers and imaginative thinkers that can marry that empathy and that imagination together to tell great stories around our places. Otherwise, we may as well leave it all to the machines and the ChatGPTs of the world, right? Speaking on imagination, I think there's a really specific breed of imagination that we need to conjure in ourselves, our consultant teams, and the communities that we co-create with, right? And that is hopeful imagination. It's really it's an interesting space at the moment. I'm sure any of you that have recently been in focus groups or had kind of end user conversations, there's a lot of what people are terming future fatigue out there in the market at the moment, where people are feeling really barraged and battered by the everyday, so much so that they have almost lost their ability to cast their minds into the future and think about what the future might hold, because they're so battered by the present that ability to vision is somewhat lost. And partner this with some scary stats, and I admit that I did see last week that BBC said that none of us were mentally affected by COVID and there was no mental health impact, but there are studies that say somewhat otherwise. And this was one from obviously mid last year that said 45% of people said that they hadn't felt happiness in the last 2 years, which is a pretty striking statistic. And when you think that if we have the combination of future fatigue and this kind of inherent unhappiness and lack of positivity and optimism, it's really the perfect storm to cut imagination off at the pass, where we feel like we can just create the same kind of safe solutions, where we're almost nervous to step out of the box and do something. We just want to kind of stick to the lane because we know that it's safe. And that just creates anywheres at the end of the day. Or worse still, it might send us down a downward spiral where everything looks like George Orwell's 1984. So I think we really need to try and harness this idea of hopeful imagination. And what's that all about? And I don't mean to say this flippantly and dismiss that we've got some really big challenges that we need to face, and we need to face them fast, right? But it's more so saying that as placemakers, we can engage communities and consultants differently, I believe. And I think this is all a bit of a challenge. We definitely haven't completely unlocked it, but I think it's a mindset that we have to start thinking through. And I was interested and I suppose introduced to this concept of hopeful imagination by Professor Max Saunders from the University of Birmingham. And he termed hopeful imagination. And he pointed to the futurologists and the science fiction writers of the 1920s and the 1930s, who, despite the ravages of war and economic depressions, were able to almost unhook themselves from that reality and imagine and come up with visions that were really fantastical, they were hopeful, and they were really vivid. These futurologists and science fiction writers came up with things like robotics, the biospheres, they came up with smartphones, they came up with visualization techniques. It was a real array. And it's almost as if they were able to, as I said, unhook from the present and dream up a reality that we're now living. And it's that kind of ability to think, I suppose, laterally and almost through a really hopeful mindset that I think is really critical for us as placemakers and place shapers to work out how we can conjure that, as I said, in ourselves, but also in communities, to really understand what the future might look like through a hopeful lens. And I think part of the way that we can do that is through engaging that childlike sense of asking why and how might we, that kind of fades with age, right? And I think that can be sometimes the techniques that we need to go into workshops with. We need to engage in things that might, as I said, sound frivolous, like whether it's play, whether it's different ways of kind of re-engaging that childlike mind that might dream up things like this, as opposed to sitting in focus groups and say, oh, I want my future city to be just a slight improvement on what it is today. We need to project things further if we want to truly get to a somewhere position, in my mind. In terms of the leave behinds for tonight, I've got 4 points to make. The first one would be always make the effort, the investment, and spend the time to treat your users as somebodies. Because as much as it's an investment up front, it's invaluable to get those insights that will really shape the place and importantly shape the identity that will enable your place to be a somewhere and not an anywhere. Secondly, I'm going to steal Bob's line here, but really start with the feeling. Define the feeling. It's not fluffy, it's really fundamental. So convince people to spend the time in those deep and meaningful conversations. Thirdly, hopefully we can all vow to not commit to the Jetsons too early and actually commit to an idea. So spend the time thinking about the ideas that you want to shape that place and not just the aesthetic that you think might be what the future looks like. And then finally, it's a task for all of us, but trying to understand how we might be able to spark hopeful imagination. So imagination is one thing, but I think what we really need to face the challenges that we're up against today is that hopeful imagination, that optimism, and that true ability to kind of look forward with a more positive lens. So I want to say a big thank you for persevering with me through that somewhat tedious technology situation. I hope you found some of those musings interesting and enriching. I strongly believe that now is the time to really start having some of these conversations around what the future of place visioning might be and the importance it might have. I'm going to hand back over to Vince, but I obviously welcome any questions that anyone might have.